We come to symbols 2, and we're deepening our understanding of the way in which thought is an elaboration of feeling, that the flow of feeling is the way in which meaning becomes interiorized. It's like the flow of time itself creates space. Space blossoms out of time. And the way in which it blossoms out of time is in an electromagnetic resonance. The equations that established how time and space relate together to create electromagnetism were developed by James Clerk Maxwell in the 1870s, Cambridge, England, the university. The height of the Victorian period in England. And the Victorian English period was famous for not wanting things to be negative, not wanting things to be too blunt, not wanting there to be anything to upset the nice, homey atmospheres that were proper to people. And so one of the most blatant qualities of the equations of electromagnetic theory are that they solve backwards just as well as they solve forwards. They solve in a negative mode as truthfully as they solve in a positive mode. And so for almost 100 years, it was not apparent that those same equations that established not only the theory of electromagnetism, but Einstein worked off them to develop his theories of relativity. It wasn't apparent for almost 100 years that those equations also solve the other way, which means then that there is a completely other spectrum of reality. And that is the magnetoelectric spectrum. And that its vibration, its resonance, is about 10 billion times what the electromagnetic spectrum is. And in the electromagnetic spectrum, energy has two distinct modes. One in which it flows, in which case it is just a dynamic where the time signature allows for space to blossom in such a way that the dynamic energy within space can cinch itself into a polarization and achieve stability as matter. And so all the matter that we generally know of is cinched energy. Energy cinched into matter. And it's cinched by polarity. And the polarity is carried so that the nucleus of the atom is cinched in a polarity with the clouds, the shells of the electrons. The electrons are negative, the nucleus with protons positive, or neutrons that are neutral. But it's this plus and minus polarity that establishes the forms of matter as we know it. But it became apparent a generation ago in a most catastrophic way that the non-occurrence of fundamental things registers just as real as the things themselves when they are paired together. And one of the areas in which this was found is in very sophisticated electronics. In very sophisticated electronics, by the late 20th century, it was realized that electrons also, when they are not in a configuration, their not being in the configuration leaves a hole. And that hole functions in reality just as if it were an electron, but in a negative way, in a completely opposite way. And so one now had to have a very sophisticated electronics where one had to take into consideration not only electrons but their holes paired together. And the upshot of this is that increasingly it has become apparent that the stylization of 100 years ago of the way in which reality is supposed to be, both in terms of mathematics and in terms of society, are enormously limiting and defective. Now, we're not going to talk about math right now. When we get to the second year, when we get to science, we'll see that this has enormous, far-reaching results. What we're concerned with today in Symbols 2 is the way in which the difficulties of the Victorian period centered mainly on individuals who then were involved in an immediate context called the family. And the Victorian family is a definite problem area. And turns out for the two figures that we're taking, Virginia Woolf and William Faulconer, all the problems that they had were with the family. They were haunted by a dysfunctional family, but a dysfunctional to an extent that would cause nightmares, horrendousness, suicides, murders. Incredible. And this family disease of the Victorian period largely focused in not just England, but because it was the British Empire, it was seeded everywhere in the world. In India, Australia, Canada, the United States, South Africa, every place that you went, British East Africa, as it was called at the time, Kenya, Tanganyika, everywhere, left its residues everywhere. One of the difficulties is being able to appreciate how horrendous it was, and Virginia Woolf is a case in point. Her family was headed by a father who was one of the most famous men of the age. He was one of the editors of the Dictionary of National Biography. He was on the top of the pecking order. He was an intellectual, the kind who made the British Empire, who made the British tradition. But his family was all centered around his wife, Julia. She kept that family together. She made that family, but Julia had been married before. She'd had 3 children before. She'd had a couple of sons and a daughter. And when she married Sir Leslie Stephen, they then had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And Virginia Woolf was one of the daughters. Her sister was Vanessa. And the 2 of them became extraordinarily famous in rejecting Victorian family values, in rejecting the entire symbolic mind that was misformed by the dysfunctional family on level of nightmare. One of the qualities that was there in Virginia Woolf is that her mother Julia, when she died, left a hole. And the hole was as real as her mother had been as a living person. And what haunted her is that her mother left this hole that was real when she was just 13 years old, just coming into adolescence, just coming into puberty, already shy and already a little bit nervous. This became for her almost an intolerable psychological situation because she was taught like everyone was taught, but especially taught by a father like she had, that you had to be specific about things. And because the mother had left a hole, there was no way to be specific about the hole that was left. And so she became haunted by it. Haunted in the sense that there was a negative ghost in her feelings all the time. Where the mother had been as a figure, there was a hole that functioned as a negative mother. And so she became increasingly, almost certifiably insane, almost had to be institutionalized, because she couldn't live with the contrast of a father who had emphasized everything must be thus and so and accurately and only that and exactly that, and the fact of a missing mother who was so real and yet couldn't be identified at all. There was no way. She was a real negative whole that existed, but in a completely different spectrum. And there was no way at that time to bring those two disparate things together at all. She was 13 in 1895. In 1895, for the first time, a man in Europe named Röntgen had misplaced some photographic paper in his laboratory, and it had gone into the same drawer as a little sample of radium. And when he brought the photographic paper out, he found that it was all cloudy. He couldn't use it. He thought, well, how can this be? And that's the way X-rays were discovered for the first time by Röntgen. And it suddenly came to the attention of just a few people in the world that matter has a psychic resonance and vibration beyond the laws that we thought were limiting to it. Because X-rays at the time were not understood at all. They were called Röntgen rays originally, that this is a part of the electromagnetic spectrum. What happened was that increasingly people wondered, well, what else is there then? What other energies are there in the universe that we know nothing about and yet are realistic, and realistic on a deeper and higher level than we live, and therefore we are actually living in a little narrow ledge of assumptions, outside of which is a wild universe that is much more energetic, much larger than even our imagination could get to. And of course, the most courageous figure at that time in science was a woman named Marie Curie, a Polish woman who went to France and was doing some work in France, and she became one of the world's greatest geniuses. And she's the one who worked with radium enough, and finally with the French husband that she took, Pierre, she's the one that found that there is such a thing as radioactivity. That the X-rays are a part of a whole range of energetic resonance of matter, that matter can be radioactive. and that there are radioactive energies that are much more powerful than any of the energies that man had ever dealt with before. And the discovery of radioactivity, especially in the work of Marie Curie, the first book on radioactivity was published in 1903 by a man from New Zealand who had gone to England to work with physics, and then went to Canada for a while, Montreal, and went back to England. His name was Rutherford, and eventually he's the one who set up the whole genius group at Cambridge University, where a lot of the early atomic and quantum theories were developed. But what was happening at this time, from, say, 1895 to about 1905, in that 10-year period, was increasingly the realization that one could not count on the universe, that the Victorian family and the British Empire and the old mentality had said was real, that it was obviously only one version of what was possible, and that what was much more real was everything wild outside of it. And so the sensitivity was, we have to now find ways to get out of the imprisoning phoniness, and we are justified in using any technique we can to do this. We have to find ways to get outside of ourselves. And so you find in that period the end of Victorian England and the beginning of what was called the Edwardian period. King Edward came in. And Edwardian England is the England of psychical research, of ghost stories, of weird happenings, of animal magnetism experiments, of a sexual revolution, of drug revolutions, of intellectual revolutions, all attempts by people to try to find ways to get outside of themselves, how to get outside of their families, how to get outside of the societies, not to denigrate oneself, not to denigrate family qua family, not to denigrate society, but that particular phoniness on every level that was found now to be an imprisonment. And that however comfortable you were within that was a self-deception. Purely a self-deception. And so what Virginia Woolf, as an exemplar that we're taking, what she was after were, she called them finally in her secret autobiographical writings unpublished, she called them moments of being. That we have to find a way in which we can allow our minds to be open enough to let the flow of experience go beyond the clutching limitations of the mind that we've been trained to have, and let moments of being occur. Transcendental moments, mystical moments. She called them eventually not just moments of being, but she said they were instances of eternity that occur within our lives. And the reason why they can occur within our lives, obviously, is that we are spirit beings. We're not limited to the body, nor are we limited to the mind. The body is very useful during its lifespan. The mind is very useful within its calibration, but they are not the final punctuation of what is possible, of what is real. And so the entire era that we're looking at becomes embodied in this sensitivity towards what is called ecstasis, ecstasy, or high wisdom, or excess. And so the people of the time, you can invite them in, the people of the time became prone to a polarity which was almost crazy. They wanted to be excessive in almost every possible way, and yet they wanted to be precise in every possible way at the same time. And so you find increasingly in the early 20th century is this pursuit that there must be a new kind of precision that's in excess. And so one began to find a kind of a convoluted, almost impossible thing previous to that, a need to find the logic of the mysteries. There must be a completely different way to be logical about reality that is logical in its terms, but not logical in the terms that were given us. And one of the new little fairy tales that was like a paradigm of this is Alice in Wonderland. Lewis Carroll was a mathematician, Charles Dodson. And Alice, when she goes to Wonderland, the logic is there in Wonderland, but it's a logic that is paradoxical all the time, and ironic all the time, and absurd all the time, surreal all the time. And so it became an Alice in Wonderland world, except that Alice in Wonderland is a story for children, whereas Virginia Woolf's novels were stories for struggling adults who were serious about needing to do this. It had to be done. And what came out of it was a double fear. One of the fears is that if we stay normal, we're going to stay jailed in falseness. Or if we go too far, maybe we're going to go too far and we're going to lose it completely. So many ways. And so you find a kind of a quivering search for a new median at that time. There must be some new balance in this between two kinds of fears. And out of this came psychotherapy. Freud, Jung. That whole movement of not psychology anymore, but psychotherapy. There must be a way to have a therapia, a therapy, a healing of the psyche. And so you find, we talked last week about William James's Principles of Psychology, the world's first text on psychology, 1890. I didn't bring it this week, but I'll bring it next week. 13 years later, another set of books the same size by a British researcher, originally in psychology. His name was Myers, F.W.H. Myers. Only his big book is all about psychic research, and it's called The Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. And it became, like William James' Psychology, one of the great bestsellers everywhere in the literate world. Everyone was reading, not just William James, but reading F.W.H. Myers. Myers in his book cites, he says, there are very few serious books about psychic energy, psychic events. He said one of the few that he ran across was called Phantasms of the Living. That we experience being haunted by psychic ghosts or psychic events or occurrences, when the haunting of us by this is an example of our limitedness of wanting to give it some kind of form in false terms. That when you open up to psychic energy in its own way, you don't get ghosts so much as you get telepathy. You don't get fearfulness so much as you get a wild talent, ability to see beyond time and space, beyond limitations. That one doesn't have to go to a doctor that gives you a physical examination and then gives you a pill for that body to get well, that someone could heal you on the other side of the world instantly by psychic energy. And so by the time Virginia Woolf was a mature lady in the 1920s, it became apparent to her that they had emerged into one of the wildest worlds of all time, and that they didn't have any place that they could trust, but that there was still the ancient quality that even on the level of psychic energy, just on the level of the most primitive, natural, physical involvement with the mysteries of life, the mysteries of nature and the psychic wild expanses of consciousness both shared the ability that one could heal if one could face the moment. And Virginia Woolf, being surrounded by this time by some of the most extraordinary people on the planet. The great founder of modern economics, John Maynard Keynes, the great poet of that time, T.S. Eliot, great art critics, the great writers, the great thinkers. They were all friends of hers. They're all clustered around and used her apartment in London, in the Bloomsbury section of London, not far from the British Museum. Because the British Museum on Great Russell Street was the place that the British Empire for centuries had sent all the wonderful, precious, rare things. The British Museum had the largest library in the world at that time. Millions of volumes. It had collections of everything: Egyptian antiquities, archaeological, anthropological. They had everything there. And so the people that lived in that neighborhood, who were in this Bloomsbury group, they had access to the entire world for all time right down the street. You could go to the British Museum and find things. If you wanted to find out about 19th dynasty Egyptian things, you could go there. There were keepers of these collections who knew these things. E.A. Wallace Budge was the keeper at the time. And as they went, they found that all these people understood man has always had psychic capacities, has always understood he had them. Death has never been a stopping coda to the spiritual capacities of human beings. And not only life surviving bodily death, but reincarnation. And not just once or twice, but continuously. And who knows if it's limited to reincarnation just on one planet or in one star system. And so all of a sudden, in the 1920s, it became apparent to these people, with the development of the advances of physics into quantum theory, the development of radioactivity into several different kinds of radioactivity. There's radioactivity, alpha radioactivity, where the nucleus of helium atoms is there, or there is a beta radioactivity, which is the electrons, and there is also a gamma ray. By the 1930s, early 30s, they discovered that there's a third kind of radioactivity, not just A, B, but a C, and that gamma ray radioactivity is way off the expected chart. And it's a radioactivity that doesn't come from material that is of atomic origin, but that gamma radiation comes from the cosmos itself. It comes from the universe. The entire universe is irradiated all the time by gamma ray radiation. So that on the scale of the largest possible reality, reality is radioactive all the time. It's a dimension of it. And so it is not at all some kind of ghostly threat. All of this by the late 1920s, early 1930s, in that little time period, was causing sensitive people like ourselves at the time to wonder, how is it then that we can at least begin? And Virginia Woolf, she realized she had to find a way to exorcise from herself the ghost of her mother and to bring back the presence of her mother as a whole. To honor that part of her and to stop truncating the memory of her in the little girl missing her dead mother. That my mother is dead. Well, no, your mother is not dead. Her spirit is still there, but her spirit is there in the whole. So one has to find a way to get rid of, exorcise the old identifiable images and symbols that had limited you so that you were blinded and couldn't see the new, larger symbols, the new, larger images, the new, larger feeling. And so her exorcism, her shamanic journey was to write To the Lighthouse. And so she wrote To the Lighthouse to get rid of the false hauntedness of a mother who was dead and to honor the new quality of the mother who was eternal in her moment of being. And so when we come to the Lighthouse, there is a quality. It's divided into 3 sections. The first section is very large. It's called the window. It means the frame through which one looks. This is a window. Not just a window, it's like a launch window. It's a square of attention, is what we call it. It is the way in which the mind, in its old-fashioned, limited way, used to frame things. That it found comfort in being able to square things and keep it framed. And that you can do many things with this frame. You can have the frame as having 4 sides. You can have the frame as having 4 angles. If it has 4 sides, then it has an organized space. If it has 4 angles, then it has a centered space. And if you work then from a centered space, you can have coordinates that go out from that center, and the coordinates will be a new square of attention that's turned inside out. It'll be a cross, but an even cross with the vertical and the horizontal lines being equal. This is a new kind of square. And it means that that square, that every one of those 4 little spaces will be a subset of the whole square, the whole space. And that if you take any one of those little subset squares and you take the center being extended to that cross and you take just 2 of those, then you have an X and a Y, and you're able then to graph what is real within that space. And so out of this comes all of the diagrams and graphs of the modern world. What are those diagrams? Take a look at them. They have a vertical axis and they have a horizontal axis. And then they plot lines and graphs in between. But pause a moment. That square is only one of 4. There's another square right next to it, which is the obverse of that square, which is just as real. So what have you graphed? on the x and y axis here that is not real in a directly opposite way, like the hole of the electron. That also, you haven't graphed it, but it is real. And since you have brought something into existence by graphing it, you have also brought its obverse into existence as well. Now you have really begun to haunt the house because there are two other squares. There's not only this side of the square that turns and shows you the other side, but there is a way to turn that square upside down and then turn that around inside out. Now one is dealing with ancient wisdom. The ancient wisdom was that this and this are a set, and this are a set, and those pair of pairs together constitute the real. And yet, because they are a square like that, the square also extends to a third axis because space has 3 dimensions. So one has not only an x and y axis, but one has a z axis. Now you're dealing not with a square, but with a cube. And when you deal with a cube, you have 4 subsets 4 times. And so a cube has a quaternary that has 16 little cubes in it. And they are all equally real. And whatever is graphed in any part of that has its resonance in the other parts. And so that generation that we're looking at, that were haunted by the discovery of radioactivity, haunted by the realization that they had been living in a phony Victorian world, that they had acclimated their individuality to families that were totally dysfunctional, actually insane. And for Virginia Woolf, it was a catastrophic realization because her mother's previous marriage had produced a daughter who was extraordinarily beautiful. Stella was her name, Stella Duckworth. And when the mother died, the father would not let the older daughter get married. He wanted to keep her for himself, selfishly. You have to take care of me. And by taking care of him, she had to listen over and over again to how much he missed her mother, who was now dead, and how horrific his life was, and how much he suffered. And so for years, she was grilled in the sophomoric grief of his possessiveness, not wanting to let her have her own life. And when she finally got married, his letters to her were so vicious in such a subtle way. Oh, my dearest Stella, how can you do this? She died within 3 months of her marriage. For people like Faulconer and Virginia Woolf, the entire range of that world was despicable, reprehensible. And they had to find ways to tear it up permanently. Not physically alone, that wouldn't do it. And not physically and mentally, that wasn't enough. They had to find a way to get the spiritual dimension into play so that it would vanish this world and never come back. Let's take a break. Let's come back, and we're trying to sensitize ourselves and alert ourselves to the subtle complexities that came to a head in the modern world 100 years ago. Because the complexities that are in place now in our lives at this time are about 1,000 times more complex. And without a historical development, they are not at all visible. George Santayana observed, and it has been frequently repeated so it becomes a truism, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it over and over and over again. It is the lesson of karma, of a causality stain that cannot go away. It doesn't matter what you do. You can carry pictures of a guru, you can cross your fingers, you can cross your heart, you can mean to do it, you can want to do it, you can try everything. None of that has any traction whatsoever. And the reason why it doesn't have any traction is that the historical reality by the early 21st century has more dimensions than that previous cultural level recognized, than that previous level of individual minds were able to integrate. Not only is reality opened up and expanded many, many, many times since, but the dimensions brought into play add. It's as if one took one more dimension to a flat surface and you get a three-dimensional space. And if you have a four-dimensional time space, it's much more complex. And if you add consciousness as a fifth dimension, a five-dimensional realm has all kinds of properties, all kinds of laws, all kinds of principles that were just not there before. And when you're working like we are now with a 10-dimensional continuum, it is just simply beyond the capacity to even get to. And so the only way is to do what our ancestors have always done. They have always learned the wisdom of being able to go back into the natural and to come forward from that in a conscientious way to let nature be as natural as it can be and to redo, to relearn by redoing all the way back up and to come out as a new person, a new human being. And in doing so, in the contemporary world, it's quite apparent that there are many ways to be human. There are many styles to be human. I remember as a adolescent, I learned to drive at 14 because of the family circumstances. I had to be able to drive. And by the time I was 16 and able to really get out on my own, be my own young man, I used to drive to Chicago with a friend of mine all the time. And we would go to Chicago because it was the big city for us. We could have gone to Detroit, we could have gone to Toronto, but for us it was Chicago. And we went to Chicago to dance with the black girls. Because in the mid-50s, there was a beautiful contrast between the way in which dancing between whites and blacks was different. In 1956, when white rock and roll was first coming out, white people danced to the beat, rock and roll. But black people danced to the rhythm. Rhythm and blues, not rock and roll. It was a completely different experience. It was dancing together. It was choreographing a movement of cooperation that got closer and closer so that the resonance became an exchange and some new quality emerged that was sweeping both of you together along. And this was dancing to rhythm and blues, quite distinct from the white rock and roll. And if you listen to the difference at the time, it comes out in something like Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets, 1955. And that's a rock and roll beat. And you would dance to that beat. But if you listen to something like The Drifters or The Stars Out Tonight, you have a rhythm and blues loveliness. You have a melodic rhythm, and it is the African rhythmic sentience that is deeper than the white rock beat feeling sentience. And what comes out of it is a completely different experience. The intensity of only following the beat leads one to accepting pharmacological highs. Rock leads to drugs naturally, whereas rhythm and blues leads to a lilt that is there in one's life. That once you have that rhythm, you can walk to that rhythm. You can work to that rhythm. You can, in your whole life, get into that flow and be in that. And what it delivers is the way in which people weed themselves out. And it happens all the time. And we live in an age of con men and of people who are impatient, who can't get into the rhythm, especially the deepest rhythm of all, and that's the rhythm of learning. And if you can't learn, this species dies. Because this species is a learning creature. It is our learning that characterizes our reality. And this reality cannot be abrogated in any particular truncated way. I talked about the way in which Virginia Woolf's novels were haunted by the death of her mother, who was no longer there. But what was there was the hole left by the mother's death. And the hole was not death. The hole was the presence of the mother in a completely different energy calibration. Instead of being cinched, polarized electromagnetic energy into matter, she was released into the magnetoelectric dimensions of openness that to us registers as space, as a whole, as nothing. But like modern electronics that deals only with electrons but electron holes, you can't manufacture things like DVDs without bringing that kind of technology into play. For Virginia Woolf 100 years ago, for that first registry that there were powers in nature that had been released, like radioactivity, like X-rays, like the psychic research energies. That whole quality in Virginia Woolf centered around in her family, because the mother's absence was constantly being framed by her father. That the mother was gone, and the father, despite his intellectual brilliance, despite a social position that was on one of the highest pecking orders in the British Empire, being the editor of the multi-volume Dictionary of National Biography, Sir Leslie Stephen was one of the makers of the British Empire, one of the makers of the whole tradition that here are the people. These are the biographies of everyone who counts. These are all the players in the national history that goes all the way back to the earliest conceivable times. But it was his tyrannizing in the form of constantly holding his children hostage to the loss of his wife. I have lost my wife. And so, as we were talking about, the older daughter that his wife from a previous marriage had was commandeered to take her place, not allowed to marry. But not allowed by a prohibition, but by a more insidious kind of prohibition of constantly saying, without you, this family's not going to hold together. You must take the mother's place. And when she finally got married, within 3 months she was dead. Nervous exhaustion. I gave a lecture at UC Berkeley in the fall of 1966. It was called The Holes of Virginia Woolf and the Holes of Henry Moore, but Henry Moore's sculpture. And when we get to art in that phase, we'll take a look at how Henry Moore's sculpture with its spaces was one of the perfect embodiments of a new, larger reality, the sense of space and openness being as important as form and structure. But as the literary work of Virginia Woolf advanced, as she was maturing as a writer, more and more she began to put within her works a dissolving of the old Victorian idea of sequencing, that the Victorian mind had a trustworthy sequence of events because it was specific, step by step, and one didn't go to the next step until you had this previous step. And it was like tracing the sequence of an alphabet. And more, as she dissolved her reliance on that, her dependence on that, she freed herself not only from the Victorian order, but from the tyranny of her family. And what became apparent to her more and more was that if you hold a terrifying image in the complete suspension of universal openness, its lack of a cognate context will evaporate its emotional significance. And what will remain is a temporary image without any kind of value. It will be just an abstract outline. This, of course, is an ancient yogic technique. That one vanishes falsity by bringing the pseudo into the presence of the eternal. And so it evaporates. And by the way, evaporates and leaves no trace whatsoever. It isn't like there's just a little bit of soot in the universe. There's nothing. That nothing, that emptiness, is the whole left by the illusion going. And out of that whole, it expands instantly, without any time whatsoever, spontaneously, into the context of the real, which is the complete openness within which the cosmos itself gains its traction, both electromagnetically and magnetoelectrically as well. This openness, this shunyata, this complete disclosure of the real has such a profound reality that it blinks back into existence all by itself instantly, so that one begins to get the interplay. I remember the professor that I did the lecture on the holes of Henry Moore and Virginia Woolf. Her name was J.J. Wilson, upper-class Virginia lady who had married one of the most torrential people I have ever met in my life. His name was Philip Wilson, and he was the head monk for the first Zen master to come to the West, Shunryu Suzuki Roshi in San Francisco. And Philip Wilson was built like a professional wrestler. He's about 230 pounds, 6'1", rock solid. When he didn't have his black Zen monk's robes on in the Zendo, he walked around in blue jeans, a t-shirt, and a big fringed buckskin jacket. I used to do the shopping with JJ for the Zen Center in San Francisco in the 60s. We would go over to Oakland to the food mill where everything organic could be got and bring the things back. And on the way, we would stop in San Francisco and eat at a particular restaurant in the Tenderloin that was grungy, but we liked it. And Philip came in one day and saw me sitting with his wife. And we were sitting in half samadhi. And of course, it just got him going. So he took off this heavy fringe jacket and threw it to the floor in the restaurant. Big flap, and everyone in the restaurant looked at this huge guy. Philip, one time, he was a movie actor. He played one of the apes in the Planet of the Apes, the original show. He was really a bruiser. And he came stomping through the restaurant, and he sat down. And I took my glass of water and offered it to him. And he took the glass of water and turned it upside down. The water flowed all over. And so I brought the glass back and turned it back up and took a drink of the openness. And he broke out laughing. And of course, the episode had come full circle back to the evaporation of a scenario which was only there dramatically to present something, and when its presentation was completed, it was over. What Virginia Woolf found in her writing increasingly is that great literature can do this as well. Because great literature is art, and art has the same capacity that a spiritual person has. A work of art can evaporate the false context that one assumed was real by participating with the work of art in its aesthetic dimension. One opens up a different kind of a space that exceeds the space of the mind. The symbolic mind has a space of thought which is exceeded by the transform operator capacities of consciousness. Consciousness so outdistances the mind. When you see classic paintings of people who have developed consciousness, you see the thought bubble, the openness around the head, or the halo, or the kinesthetic sense that they have psychic powers and energies, which they do. But consciousness, when it has just its flow, is a process. It's not a form at all. The form that emerges out of consciousness, we'll see, is a differential form, and that form is markedly different from integral forms. The body and the mind are most definitely integral forms. They have structures that can be understood electromagnetically. They have an atomic structure. There's no doubt. But the work of art, like the spiritual person, is a differential prism and does not have that structure. It has a differential structure. Its array is not a structure of order, but it is a revelation of arrays of possibility. As of consciousness as a medium within which a form of infinite possibility comes into prismatic play. The traditional way to speak of it is that one now is a jeweled being. No longer the stone, nor even a thinking stone, but now a jewel whose radiance, whose radiant facets, qualities is kaleidoscopic. And so kaleidoscopic consciousness outdistances the integral mind by many times. Virginia Woolf and William Faulconer as well found that this was not only true, but it was true in a way that they had not expected, because they had been struggling, as we talked earlier before the break, they were struggling to get out of the pseudo-society they lived in, the pseudo-families they lived in. Faulconer, when he was a young man, he was only 5'5", and he constantly wanted to get into some real-life adventure, and he was turned down in the First World War from the American Air Force because he was too short and he didn't weigh enough. So he went to Canada and joined the RAF. And in the RAF, where he learned to fly, he had a plane crash and came back wounded from the plane crash and had a cane. And he had his RAF uniform on. And in the little town of Oxford, Mississippi, when he came back, everybody in Oxford said, well, he thinks he's important. They used to call him Count No Count. Here's Billy Faulconer, and he even spells his name different now. He put a U in the family name. Everyone knows his family. The Faulconers have been around since this county in Mississippi. It's called Lafayette County. It was formed in 1837. Faulconer born in 1897, 60 years later. The big railroad that went across northern Mississippi from Corinth all the way down to Clarksburg is called the W.C. Faulconer Railroad. His grandfather built it. And everyone said, well, he's not content just to be a Faulconer. He wants to be some kind of international hero. He thinks he's better than us. And as Faulconer began to write more and more, he began to realize, as he said by 1930, he said, I stopped writing potboilers because I realized that characters cast shadows. That when you do a literary work in a conscious way, those characters become as real as human beings. He used to say, one of his favorite readings was Don Quixote. And he used to say, Don Quixote is more real to us than any person who lived in the 16th century. That literary figures become universally real as spiritual characters that now, as long as people experience them, they are there. They re-emerge as realistic. And so as I lay dying, that we're taking a look at along with Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, these two writers both were struggling to get outside of a false individuality, to let the true character that they had express itself beyond the false family, beyond the false society, and eventually both of them realized it wasn't just limited to a false individuality that somebody foisted on you, especially kept in place by a phony family, a dysfunctional, damaged, vicious family dynamic all too often, but that the entire world had been misshapen again and again for so long that one had to go back to primordiality. One had to go back to some kind of nature initiation to free oneself at the very base, at the very foundation. And for Faulconer, of course, being raised in the early 20th century America, northern Mississippi, pioneer family, and we talked last week about how boys at that time were taught to hunt. that when you were 12, you were given a family gun, and you were taken out with the men to learn to hunt, which meant to learn to kill. To kill, to live. To bring the game back home. To set it on the table. The phrase is still there. You go out there and you get it and you set it on the table and you hunt for that. And this is what men do. And in that hunting, it is necessary to kill. But for Faulconer, trying in his literature to get out of that purely white Southerner colonialist milieu, he looked more and more to two other sources that were there. One, the Indians, and the other, the African Americans. And he put both those different groups together in one figure, and he called him Sam Fathers. And Sam Fathers is half black, half Choctaw Indian. And he's the one who in The Bear, we talked last week about Go Down Moses, one of his greatest novels, and one of the big sections in it is called The Bear. It's maybe the most famous short work in American fiction. Holds a level that Billy Budd by Melville holds. And it is the art shamanic way that Faulconer conveys the initiation back to the primordial with Sam Fathers, so that any reader who reads it gets that initiation. It really occurs for them. And we talked last week about how Sam Fathers told him, you cannot go into the big woods like these men who come here. They come here first to drink, to get drunk, to get rid of the taste of their families, to get rid of the taste of the phony world that they have to live in. And then they go out simply to kill, not just to hunt, to bring something home for the table, but to go and get it and do it in. He said, you have to be different. And in order to do this, you have to give the three coordinates that world depends on to do this in. You have to set them aside. The compass, the watch, and the gun. And once one sets this aside, then the big woods will invite you of itself to participate in its reality, its context. And the more that you participate in its context, the more the phony world will evaporate. The more the phony individuality will simply fall away. And that's when the boy meets the bear. And the bear and he have this moment of seeing each other, not as killers, not as hunters, but as spiritually tuned beings that share a reality. Later in The Bear, Sam Fathers tells him, now that you have been a part of nature on this primordial level, now you must learn that you must also be able to live in the world of men. And so you have to go into killing in a different way, hunting in a different way. You have to participate in the way in which the killing is done, so that you do not do it out of anger or fear or out of any kind of inflated, phony quality, but that this is a ritual process of life and is necessary. And the deer and you will become one because you will live by incorporating the deer to your body, to your life. Here's a little bit of the section. At first there was nothing. There was the faint, cold, steady rain, the gray and constant light of the late November dawn with the voices of the hounds converging somewhere in it and toward them. Then Sam Fathers standing just behind the boy, as he'd been standing when the boy shot his first running rabbit, with his first gun and almost with the first load it ever carried, touched his shoulder, and he began to shake, not with any cold. Then the buck was there. He did not come into sight. He was just there, looking not like a ghost, but as if all of light were condensed in him, and he were the source of it, not only moving in it, but disseminating it. Already running, seen first, as you always see the deer, in that split second after he has already seen you, already slanting away in that first soaring bound, the antlers, even in that dim light, looking like a small rocking chair balanced on his head. Now, Sam Father said, shoot, quick and slow. Squeeze the trigger. The boy did not remember that shot at all. He would live to be 80. And as his father and his father's twin brother and their father in his turn had lived to be, but he would never hear that shot, nor remember even the shock of the gun butt. He didn't even remember what he did with the gun afterwards. He was running. Why did he not remember? Because the mind that he had been given, had been educated to have by school, by family, by culture, everything was to see that memory you remember because you remember the images. And he was in the mystery of nature, which has no images whatsoever. That's why in deep meditation, if you still have images in your mind, you're not in deep enough. The boy was just running because he was in the process of his experience that had flowed with nature. Nature is a pure process. And when experience participates in it in that indelible way, it flows like nature flows without images whatsoever. That's why in Zen, no image. Faulconer says, then he was standing over the buck where it lay in the wet earth, still in the attitude of speed and not looking at all dead. Standing over it, shaking and jerking, is crying, with Sam Fathers beside him again, extending the knife. Don't walk up to him in front, Sam said. If he ain't dead, he will cut you to pieces with his feet. Walk up to him from behind and take him by the horn first, so you can hold his head down until you can jump away. Then slip your other hand down and hook your fingers in his nostrils. The boy did that, drew the head back and the throat taut, and drew Sam Father's knife across the throat. And Sam stopped and dipped his hands in the hot smoking blood, wiped them back and forth across the boy's face. Literature, like all great art, like spiritual persons, can prism so that the mind does not get in the way of the flow of experience that participates in nature without a hitch. So that nature and experience and consciousness all flow together like three streams together, like a rhythm of a ribbon that doesn't have any interference whatsoever. Now, if you're dancing like you're dancing to rock and roll, you're waiting to pick up the beat, you're going to miss it. You have to be in the rhythm and blues, not the rock and roll. Because that rhythm is a participatory rhythm that extends out in natural resonance all the way through harmonics that involve the cosmos. But there is a fourth process, a fourth flow that is yet to be encountered. Yet to be encountered here until we are able to mature ourselves and realize that that fourth flow is history. That the historical hyperdimension of consciousness is a flow like nature, a flow like experience, a flow like consciousness, but on a very high energy level but its high energy is not integral, it's differential. Not only are there possibilities, but now there are infinite possibilities. It transforms one to bring the dimension of the possible into play in the world, but to bring the play of infinity into the world is staggering, because it blinks back and forth between a tuning fork of 0 and infinity. And its blinking back and forth in that tuning fork has a pivot, not a balance, but has a pivot at the center of the mind. And it is only then, in that tuning fork resonance, that one has the calibration of the mind's pivot. The Chinese phrase for it in ancient times was the pivot of the 4 quarters. For us, we understand now that it isn't just 4 quarters, but when you have a cubic volume, you have 16, the pivot of the 16. In India, it's called the Dharma Chakra. There are 16 spokes to the Dharma Chakra, to the wheel of truth. But the high Dharma takes into consideration not only the spokes, but the spaces in between. And not only the spaces in between, but the way in which there's an obverse to the spokes and an obverse to the spaces as well. And when you bring that entire matrix together, you have 64. The 64 hexagrams of the I Ching, the 64 matrix of the codons of DNA, 16 to the 4th, 2 to the 8th. It has a way in which one can understand the gradient. And once one gets the gradient of proportion, the gradient of ratioing, to that extent, one has, as the saying used to be, one has cut the jewel. One gets the prismatic pivot that gives you the kaleidoscope of infinite and empty simultaneously tuned. Then one has learned. More next week.